Welcome back to the Recipe Analyst. Today we're going to be analyzing Eric's Staff Lasagna from the French Laundry Cookbook by Thomas Keller. As with most recipes, you have to start out with prep, and for this recipe we're going to be using fresh tomatoes, so we should get those ready to go as soon as possible. Of course, we have to remove them from the vine. Twisting the tomatoes off of the vine usually makes it a little bit easier to separate the two. And for this recipe, it calls for peeled tomatoes, so we're going to have to blanch and cool them quickly to be able to get the skin off pretty easily. One thing I will say about this recipe is that it doesn't actually tell you how to peel tomatoes. So I was pretty sure it wouldn't be easy just to try to peel them without any special steps, so I had to look it up. And essentially what you have to do is kind of score the bottoms of the tomatoes just so you have a place to start peeling them from. And then you put them in some boiling water just for 30 seconds or so, and it'll tighten up the skin so it peels away from the flesh of the tomato. So we're going to do that later. We got the water on the stove to boil. Now we're going to work on the onions. So the recipe calls for about 1.5 cups of onions. I use one pretty decent sized onion, and that gave me a little bit over 1.5 cups of onion. As you can see, I'm not a professional chef. I don't have the greatest knife skills in the world, but it gets the job done. Just be careful if you're not super confident around a knife, and you shouldn't cut yourself. And the onions are supposed to be minced, which is pretty small, but we're going to be cooking this sauce for a pretty long time. So those onions will basically disappear at the end of the cook time. So if you leave them a little bit larger like I did, it shouldn't be too big of a deal. Next, I'm going to work on the garlic. If you're not familiar with peeling garlic, what you have to do is kind of pound it. If you don't have a specialty tool to peel the garlic, you can just put it under the blade of your knife, hit it once or twice, and it'll loosen up the skin from the garlic. And similar to the onion, the recipe says the garlic should be minced, but if you just chop it up fairly finely, you should be fine. When you cook these kind of ingredients for a long time, they get really soft and kind of end up disappearing in the sauce. So as long as you don't leave them in big chunks, they should work just fine. Next, I'm going to chop up the basil. You probably should wash the basil before you chop it, but I skipped that step here. I don't think it should be too big of a deal, but if you disagree, feel free to wash your basil. Next, we're going to work on those tomatoes and getting that skin off. So I have a bowl of ice water so we could immediately cool off the tomatoes when they come out of the boiling water. I'm going to add a few at a time, 2 to 3 tomatoes in the boiling water, and let them sit there for 25-30 seconds. You can kind of see when the flesh and the skin start to separate as the skin kind of peels back from the flesh. and that's a pretty good indicator of when the tomatoes are ready to come out. And once you're done with all your tomatoes and you have them all cooled off, you can put them on your cutting board. Try to dry them off a little bit, make things a little easier, less slippery. Then you can use a paring knife to get under the skin to make it a little bit easier. Some of them slide right off, but others you might need to get it started with the paring knife, and just peel off the skin as much as you can, and repeat that for all of the tomatoes. Now that we have the tomatoes peeled, we're just gonna chop them up. They don't need to be super fine or anything like the onions or garlic. What I did was quarter them and then slice them into smaller slices. And I have 2 4-cup measuring cups to put the tomatoes in. We need a total of 8 cups of tomatoes. So I'm just gonna work through that right now. Next, I'm gonna chop up some parsley that goes in the ricotta mixture. For some reason, I decided to rinse this off. I think it's because in the past, I've definitely noticed that parsley and cilantro tend to have some grit in it, so I definitely wanted to get that off. And for this, I think chopping parsley can kind of be, I don't want to say difficult, but maybe a little bit tricky sometimes. But just chop it up to the best of your ability. Make sure it's fairly broken up. Next, I have the large pot, go for medium heat. I let that heat up a little bit before adding my oil. Then I let the oil heat up for a minute or two. Then I add the onions and garlic. Give it a nice little stir. And we're gonna cook that until the onions and garlic are translucent. So that's maybe 5 minutes. While that's going, I get the tomato paste open and I just measure it out to 1/2 cup, which is pretty much the whole can. And that can is 6 ounces, by the way. The onions and garlic are pretty cooked down and translucent. I go ahead and add the tomato paste, give it a stir to break it up and kind of get it more homogenized with the rest of the ingredients. The recipe says we're going to cook this for about 10 minutes. You want to make sure that you stir it pretty frequently because you can get some sticking on the bottom, and if you leave it for too long it will burn, and you don't want that burnt flavor in your sauce. It'll just intensify over the long cook time. Once the tomato paste mixture is ready to go, I'll add the tomatoes and give that a good stir to get everything mixed together. Then, since I decided to go with the oven method for this recipe, there is another method where you could just leave it on the stove, but you have to be more vigilant with it and kind of check it every 10 minutes. So instead, I decided to do the oven method, which takes a longer time, but you can just kind of leave it, set it and forget it for 3 to 4 hours. And with that method, you need a parchment paper lid. which you make by cutting out a square similar to the size of the pot. You fold it into a triangle, and you fold that triangle into smaller triangles. And then you kind of place that center, or that sharp point at the end, as close to the center of the pot as you can. Cut it where the rim would be. Then you cut the tip off about 1/2 inch in to have a little steam hole. You put that on the top. So I'm gonna stir up the sauce a little bit more, and then I'll put that parchment paper top over it. The fitment wasn't perfect, but I think it'll be just fine. And once that top is on, I'll put it in the oven for 3 to 4 hours. I ended up letting it bake for 3 hours. Next, I'll get to work on the mozzarella. I ended up getting sliced mozzarella on accident. It's supposed to be whole so I can grate it on the grater, as you can see. But I just decided to chop it up into smaller pieces, and I think that should get the job done. Once it's all chopped up, I'll put it in the refrigerator until we need it later for assembly. Next, I'll go ahead and get the ricotta mixture all mixed together. I already had an open container of ricotta, so I used the rest of that and most of the second container of ricotta to get, I think it's 1.5 pounds of ricotta that we need. And then I'll whisk in the 2 eggs. Just whisk it until it's fairly combined, fairly well combined. Then we'll add the parsley, the salt, and the pepper. I like to cook with ricotta fairly often, probably more often than the average person. I like ricotta pancakes, and sometimes I make these little quesadillas with a ricotta and kale. So I know that it could take a pretty good amount of salt. When you're done, you can just give it a quick taste. I know it has raw eggs, but you want to make sure that it's well seasoned. And once you have the flavor where you want it to be, you can put it in the refrigerator because we won't need it for a while. Alright, this sauce is cooked for 3.5 hours. It's reduced. Looks like the basil doesn't want to go in, but I'm going to make sure it goes in. I'm stirring the basil and just let it chill out for about an hour to come close to room temperature. While that's cooling off, I'll go ahead and make some pasta noodles from scratch. This is the first time that I've ever made pasta from scratch, so I hope it's worth the effort. Had to beat the egg, and then I'll just add in the olive oil and water directly to the egg instead of doing it separately. I'll measure out the semolina flour. Add some salt. And give it a quick mix just to kind of redistribute or distribute the salt throughout the flour. Once I gave it a pretty good mix, I'll make a little well in the center of the flour so I can pour in the egg, oil, and water. I did basically put just enough to fill that well, a little too much actually, as you can see. I'm gonna try to get it into a rough dough using the bench scraper just to get a preliminary mix. Add the rest of that egg mixture that I didn't get to add at the beginning. Once I have a pretty rough dough that's kind of holding itself together for the most part, I'll just start kneading it by hand from here. If you watched my previous video on the biscuits by Joshua Weissman, this kneading is somewhat similar to mixing that dough, but of course the texture is a lot different here. Just kind of want to fold it over on itself to bring it together to start. Once it holds itself together, it'll start to become a lot smoother and less sticky, as you can see, and it'll become a lot more elastic instead of brittle. There shouldn't be any cracks by the end of your kneading. And once you're done kneading, you'll just wrap it up either in a plastic bag or a towel. I just use a towel since there's no need to use a plastic bag if you don't have to. After letting the pasta dough rest for 20 minutes, we're gonna roll it out. Just like most other doughs, light flouring on your work surface can help prevent sticking. So to make rolling it out a little bit easier, I just kind of flatten it a little bit before I start rolling with the rolling pin, and then I just roll it out as thinly as possible. Every now and then I might want to lift up the dough and add some more flour underneath just to reduce the sticking as much as possible. The dough is pretty elastic, so once it does start sticking, it'll look bigger on the work surface than it will actually be when you cut it and take it off the work surface, because it's being held down by the work surface. So if you keep it loose on that work surface, you get a better idea of the actual size of the dough. And since I'm making lasagna, I definitely want those noodles to be as thin as I can make them. So you can kind of see through this dough. You can kind of see the pattern of the countertop through the dough. So I think that's pretty good. I think it still might be a little bit thicker than what you would typically find in a store-bought pasta. But hey, we're doing it from scratch today, so it's okay if it's a little bit thicker. Once we have that dough rolled out to the thickness that we want, we can start cutting out the noodles. The shape that I have is a little awkward, so I cut it into these weird shapes. If you make it more into a rectangle, you should probably have an easier time. Now I'm gonna go ahead and season the mozzarella just with some salt and pepper. Then we're gonna prepare for the assembly of the lasagna. Alright, we're gonna start with about a cup, 3/4 of a cup to a cup of sauce at the very bottom. Spread that out as evenly as you can. and top that with your first layer of noodles. Next, we're gonna add about half of the ricotta mixture. Just like with all the other layers, we're gonna spread it out as evenly as possible. Top that with another layer of pasta. Then we're gonna reserve 1 cup of the sauce, set that aside, and then put the rest of the sauce on top of that layer of noodles. Spread it out again. Top that sauce with another layer of noodles. And as you can see, I'm running out of noodles, so this top layer that comes after this isn't gonna be a full layer. We're gonna use the rest of that ricotta mixture on top of that layer of noodles. And then we're gonna see here, I only have enough noodles left to do maybe half of the casserole, the lasagna here. And we're gonna top that with the remaining cup of sauce. Spread it out, and then finally top that with the mozzarella. So with the pasta, I think maybe if I rolled it out in a better shape, or maybe a little bit thinner, I could have had just enough to do all the layers fully. Then we're gonna put that in the oven, bake it for 50 minutes. After 50 minutes, I wanted a little extra color on the top of my lasagna, so I decided to put it on a baking sheet to catch any splatters that might be happening. And I'm gonna put it under the broiler on low for just a few minutes, maybe 2, 3, maybe even 4 minutes. Just monitor it to get the browning that you want, just like that. Now we're ready to plate it up. As for the analysis of this recipe, I thought it was pretty good. Definitely takes a long time. There's definitely some good flavor here. The sauce is surprisingly sweet and flavorful. There's no sugar added, no salt added to the sauce. I was really impressed there. I really liked the noodles. They had a really good flavor from that fresh semolina flour. Overall, I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10. It's going to lose 2 points just because the amount of time that it takes. If I spend that much time on a recipe, I really want it to blow me away. This is a solid lasagna, just nothing that I would write home about. Anyway, thanks for watching, and if you want more details about this analysis, you could always read the blog at therecipeanalyst.com. Thanks.